Thank you. I'm really excited to be here and looking forward to our conversation over the next few days. What I'm presenting today is a somewhat new project. I'm still exploring it, so I'm very interested in your comments and feedback. I'll be talking today about digital utopianism, the idea that information technology can bring about radically good social change, and how digital utopianism has motivated a particular vision for a more sustainable electrical power grid. So you can get a sense of digital utopianism from this 2001 quote from Wired. Every node in the power network of the future will be awake, responsive, adaptive, price-smart, eco-sensitive, real-time, flexible, humming, and interconnected with everything else. And here's another example of digital utopianism. This one is from a group of policymakers and industrialists. Rewiring the grid with advanced computer controls would allow power to be distributed more efficiently, safely, and securely. It would at once save energy, create jobs, reduce emissions, and enhance American security. So as this suggests, there are many different goals for what a smart grid would do. The 2007 U.S. Energy Independence and Security Act supports the development of a smart grid, defined as the, quote, increased use of digital information and controls technology to improve reliability, security, and efficiency of the electric grid, and then followed by a very long list of different technologies and practices that could achieve that. Now, by this definition, the grid has actually been getting smart for a really long time. Historians such as David Mendel, Thomas Hughes, many others, have noted that the power industry developed computers to optimize and control network operations a long time ago, nearly 100 years since this has been going on. This picture here shows a computer for a power generator in 1964. And this history then prompts me to ask, what has it meant historically to make grids smart? I mean, smart for whom, smart for what? And so in other words, what goals have shaped smart grid historically? So to address this question, I am analyzing the smart grid as what Gabriel Hecht has termed a techno-political regime, a system of artifacts, experts, organizations, policies, and paradigms that both reflect and enact socio-political goals. My goal is to better understand how information technologies and what sometimes gets called information infrastructures both enable and enact specific socio-political goals. And I'm advancing a two-part argument. First, the digital utopianism played a significant and underanalyzed role in restructuring the U.S. electricity industry in the 1980s and 1990s. And second, the industry restructuring in the 1980s and 1990s encouraged utilities to develop and deploy information technology in ways that tended to sacrifice reliability, security, and even physical efficiency to some extent in favor of greater economic efficiency, by which I mean reducing costs. And I will discuss how technology became a tool for advancing policy goals in three main parts. First, I'll discuss how the power industry developed large centralized computers to grow the industry and to increase consumption and the economic efficiency of electricity. And second, I'll discuss how things began to change in the 1970s as public pressures for better reliability, security, and efficiency grew. And then finally, I'll discuss some unintended consequences of the move towards microprocessors and networks. And basically just discuss how they were, the goal of increasing economic efficiency and lowering costs led to an unanticipated trade-off in terms of reliability and security. So the first period I'm going to discuss is one in which the electrical utilities were attempting to grow their networks. Utilities operated as vertically integrated companies that generated, transmitted, and distributed electricity, which I've suggested here in this image. And as I'll discuss in just a minute, utilities gained economies of scale and scope by operating increasingly large networks and generators. So in the early 20th century, many utility managers began to argue that they were a, quote, natural monopoly. They could better serve the public if they were allowed to expand beyond individual municipalities. This map shows areas that were interconnected in 1925. And as you can see, power companies controlled areas that were considerably larger than cities, but there was not a unified grid here. And the utilities actually endorsed state regulation. Utilities were willing to comply with rate regulations in exchange for a guaranteed rate of return on their investment. So by 1922, 37 states were regulating utility companies. By 1935, the Federal Power Commission gained responsibility for regulating interstate electricity commerce. Now, while these larger networks offered several advantages, they required computers both to actually model how the networks would run and to plan and to actually operate them. So computers enabled power companies to gain economies of scale. So one example of this was that they enabled power companies to build larger and larger turbines. Larger generators are more efficient, but they're also more complex. This chart here on your right, yes, on the right, shows the expectation that the generators are going to grow increasingly large and complex in the 1960s. It dates to the early 1970s. And in 1965, IEEE Spectrum explained that with the present increasing demand for electrical power, the trend is toward larger capacity and more complex turbine generators. The instrumentation, recording, alarm systems, and the remote controls to enable the plant to be operated from the control room under very adverse conditions will produce a massive data too great for one operator either to act upon or comprehend. A manager of General Electric also explained that computers were needed because these larger, increasingly large generating plants were becoming too complex for human operators to manage. This is a quote from the New York Times. An operator today would have to have a fantastic memory and a pair of roller skates to duplicate the ability of a computer to effectively analyze 1,200 bits of information every 15 seconds, as will be done with future power stations. Which of course sounds very slow to us today, but at the time this was cutting edge. So the goal of these systems was not so much to conserve energy, and the goal of these computers was not so much to conserve energy, but to increase the production and the efficiency, the economic efficiency of producing energy. They also earn electricity. Computers also enabled companies to gain economies of scope by increasing their load factor, which is defined as the average load divided by the maximum load over some period of time. So this chart shows the changing load in California on one day, and you can see that different sectors need more electricity at different times. Ideally, utilities would like this curve to be completely flat, making the load factor exactly 1, because then the system would be constantly used at full capacity. And by contrast, if a utility has a very small load factor, then it has to maintain capital-intensive equipment just sitting around idle most of the time. And the reason this has to happen is that we can't actually store electricity in large amounts, although, as Cyrus just mentioned, it's been a long-term goal is to get better electricity storage. So because they have to keep demand and generation almost perfectly equal, there's actually can be certain advantages in diversifying the number of areas served to increase the network, and that potentially allows a more flat load curve. However, these larger networks also become more complicated and they require more computation to both plan how they're going to operate and how they're going to run, and to actually operate them. So computers are also used to optimize the mix of power generation, or what's known as economic dispatch. Ideally, companies want to turn on the cheapest sources of power first and the most expensive sources of power last. And I'm illustrating that with this chart. This chart shows how the incremental cost of power grows as additional power sources are brought online through the day. So hydroelectric power, that's the flat line because it tends to stay on all the time. After hydroelectric, then the cheapest form of electrical power would be used next. It might be coal. And then the next cheapest would be turned on. It might be natural gas. I'm not saying these are actually coal and natural gas, but this is the idea, that you would bring on more expensive power only as you need it. And in order to calculate what the ideal mix is and to lower the costs of electricity production, you need computers. And computers, this shows the early bird computer in 1958. It was used, first used at Southern Services in 1958 to first model and then to actually control economic dispatch for about 7 million people in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and Mississippi. So in short, computers were used to expand electrical power generation in several ways. They were used to model behavior of large and complex networks, to plan larger systems of economic dispatch, to control the growing size and complexity of networks, and and to control the growing number and size of power plants. And early computerization then was aimed at expanding the production of electricity. It was not aimed at conservation or reducing it. And the strategy was pretty successful for quite a while in actually reducing electricity costs. So this chart shows between 1920 and 1973, electricity consumption grew at an average annual rate of 7%, despite a dip in the Great Depression, and the cost of electricity steadily dropped throughout this time. However, in the 1970s, the cost of electricity stopped dropping and even rose a little bit, which you can see in the second part of the graph, the right-hand part of the graph. In addition to an increase in electricity prices, there were other factors that caused the public to call for a new paradigm by the utility sector. So first, on November 9th, 1965, New England experienced what was then the worst blackout to that time, leaving about 30 million people without power. And the blackout hit over 80,000 square miles of territory. It lasted only a few minutes in some regions, but up to half a day in others. The 1965 blackout then anticipated several broader anxieties about what came to be known as energy security. So this cartoon suggests one source of anxiety about energy security. The early 1970s oil crisis nurtured these criticisms that the U.S. had become too dependent on oil and calls for utilities to stop expanding the production of electricity, but to start being more efficient. The physicist Amory Lovins, in this well-known article and book, emerged as a very persuasive opponent to both nuclear power and to other large centralized forms of power generation. In his widely cited article in Foreign Affairs, Lovins argued that the U.S. was pursuing a, quote, hard path in which it became reliant on polluting, non-renewable sources of power. And he advocated that the U.S. should instead pursue a soft path, in which the decentralization of electrical power production and increased efficiency of appliances, so lowering net consumption of electricity for the same work done, would reduce reliance on foreign oil and other polluting energy sources. So an important point of this is that Levin's argument was about changing both the physical and social basis for generating power, the physical and social organization of power production, making the production of power more egalitarian, curbing the power of large organizations, and thereby achieving more resilient systems. And that led to a new paradigm for how the utilities should operate and how they should use information technology. It had an immediate impact in the 1970s on the regulatory environment. In 1978, the Congress passed and President Jimmy Carter signed the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act, PURPA, which required power companies to purchase energy from independent power producers at the avoided cost to the utility. So PURPA inadvertently was not intended to start a process of deregulation, but it actually did start to move things in that direction. For one thing, it was very successful in terms of increasing the number of independent power producers who generally used cogeneration facilities that were more efficient in terms of their total use of energy than the electrical power generators were. And the total number of independent energy producers began to expand their share of the U.S. electricity supply. They went up from about 2.9% to about 7% between 1979 and 1990. So to many observers, this seemed to prove that a free market model was the best way to increase the efficiency of the grid. In the wake of the 1991 Gulf War and renewed concerns about energy security, the U.S. Congress passed the Energy Policy Act of 1992, which required that utilities open their transmission lines for any generator to sell wholesale power to distributors. So basically anybody could participate in this market. And although state commissions retained the right to regulate the retail price of electricity that's distributed to consumers, this act basically transformed the grid into a marketplace. So historians have discussed these regulatory changes in great detail, but what previous accounts really haven't talked about much is how information technology played into these changes, the way it enabled them, and the way that a certain vision for information technology drove them to some extent. So during restructuring, many industry observers began to call for utilities to use microprocessors to manage distributed energy resources. And again, this is sort of about the decentralization of power production. Distributed energy resources included the independent power producers, such as cogeneration facilities, when these building owners in a cogeneration facility basically generate both heat and power and electrical power at the same time. So that improves the overall efficiency. It also included things like demand-side management technologies like smart meters. Smart meters can be used to bill customers for their energy, their electricity use based on the time at which they use it, so companies can then charge more when electricity is more expensive, and can incentivize people to change their patterns of use. Companies also began making deals with sort of large electricity consumers and saying, we'll give you a low rate all the time if you let us shut you off during times when we really need the power. So these were ways of increasing economic efficiency as well. And distributed energy resources also included things like solar and wind energy. The key point I want to make here is that in order to manage all of these different types of electricity generation and changes in demand, you needed to have these microprocessors. Another, which was a big shift then away from the large centralized computers that were driving power grid before. Additionally, computer networks were needed in order to create centralized spot markets for restructured industries. So after the Energy Policy Act of 1992, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission encouraged utilities to form nonprofit independent system operators, they're also called regional transmission operators, in order to manage spot markets for power. So this in turn, of course, required computer networks. And this image here shows the California Independent System Operators control room, where they basically manage this market of selling electricity and from the generators to the distributors. And this figure here shows the number of ISOs and RTOs that we have today. There are 7 that control about 2/3 of the U.S. energy supply. So again, it's important to emphasize that these changes were driven in part by a digital utopian narrative about information technology. So to give you an example of that, in 1982, researchers at MIT's Energy Lab argued that recent breakthroughs in microelectronics are a significant portion of what enables electric power to be removed from the category of a natural monopoly. And similarly, in 1990, an industry leader at the Electric Power Research Institute in Palo Alto, in the heart of Silicon Valley, of course, argued that microprocessor technologies offer utilities both social and business advantages and at the same time protect the environment, that they are the only way to meet the challenge of a sustainable future. And these arguments are being made in the context of advocating for a different market structure and deregulation. Now, despite promises that digital technology would improve efficiency, the creation of free markets through computer networking unfortunately introduced more uncertainty and interactive complexity into the system. And in this context, there began to be new challenges to maintaining a reliable operating system. And information technology came to be seen not only as a tool for improving efficiency, but also and energy security by extension, but also for increasing reliability. So in 1997, an article published in IEEE Computer Applications and Power coined the phrase smart grid as an acronym for self-managing and reliable transmission grid, explaining that as open transmission access is becoming a reality, a major concern of electric power utilities is to maintain the reliability of the grid. Smart devices form the line of defense at the low level and offer the most advanced protections to use local information. So the goal of using information technology to improve grid reliability really took hold after the greatest blackout in North American history, the Trump 1965 and August 2003. This blackout affected about 50 million people. The satellite image shows you the area that was affected. Some areas had no power for up to 4 days. And this helped to build political momentum for a smart grid in the United States. The phrase smart grid finally entered popular parlance not long after the blackout began, when the New York Times published an op-ed by New Jersey Governor James McGreevey, who argued that using digital sensors, computer modeling, and real-time data, a smart grid would revolutionize our antiquated system. The current grid worked like an old telephone switchboard, but a smart grid would function more like the internet. So by the new millennium, the smart grid had come to represent many goals. Increased economic efficiency, meaning reduced costs, physical efficiency, meaning reduced carbon, security, and reliability. But the question we should ask then is, has information technology, which has been being used for a long time, has it actually improved efficiency, security, and reliability? I'm going to consider each of those goals really briefly. So has the increased use of microprocessors increased economic efficiency, or meaning has it actually reduced costs? So the evidence of this is somewhat mixed. Certainly the use of demand response and distributed energy resources cut costs. However, the jury is actually out on whether industry restructuring cut costs. And one reason that it might not have cut costs is that the computers that were needed to, big control centers like CalISO that I'm showing here, that are needed to actually create a competitive market have their own costs. And a lot of that was not factored into sort of digital utopian narrative about how information technology was going to create this sustainable grid of the future. So another question to ask is whether a smarter grid has actually been more physically efficient. And the answer to this is also complicated because distributed energy resources were used in complex ways. So the rise of demand-side management and independent power producers certainly did save energy. But some of the independent power producers suspected that utilities used demand-side management, quote, to suppress the need for adding new independents, because then they wouldn't have to basically, if there was enough electricity supply out there to manage the demand with demand-side management, then there wouldn't be enough demand for these independent power producers, and it would basically squelch their competition. So in other words, utilities use distributed computing and energy resources to decentralize the physical production of power, but today they have not really significantly decentralized social power. So furthermore, centralized markets created more wasteful long-distance transmission, so that's a potential way in which the free market model has potentially actually decreased physical efficiency, even if it's increased economic efficiency. And evidence also suggests that the increased use of microprocessors in computer networks has created some other unanticipated consequences. So, although microprocessors were supposed to increase reliability, utilities used decentralized IT, information technology, and energy resources to defer investments in transmission because there was a lot of regulatory uncertainty. They said, well, look, we can now operate closer to the margins of error because we have this smart technology that will help us do it well. What that means is that they then stopped investing in transmission capacity because they weren't quite sure what the regulators were going to do. More competitive wholesale markets also create more interactive complexity and higher transmission volumes at the same time that there's less transmission capacity. So the result, which you can see here, is that we've actually had more blackouts, more frequent blackouts, and larger blackouts in the past 20 years or so. And that's shown in this chart here. So additionally, the adoption of standardized digital computers raised new concerns about cybersecurity. In 1997, the President's Commission on Protecting Critical Infrastructures noted that today, the right command sent over a network to a power generating station's control computer could be just as devastating as a backpack full of explosives. And this report then expressed concerns about the growing use of inexpensive, standardized computer technology. In 2004, the General Accounting Office showed that the number of attempted security breaches on critical infrastructure increased from the early 1990s, which is shown here, largely because of this increased use of cheap, standardized hardware and software. So although utilities could in fact use information technology to create better security, there are ways of doing that, they haven't had a whole lot of incentive to do this. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission still has very, very limited authority to enforce any kind of cybersecurity standard. So to summarize, I've analyzed the smart grid as a techno-political regime, meaning a system of artifacts, organization, experts, policies, and paradigms that work together to both reflect and enact specific socio-political goals. And as we've seen, this power grid has been getting smart for a very long time. But what it is meant to be smart has shifted over time. So in the early and mid-20th century, large centralized computers were developed to both expand production and consumption of electric power, making the grid more efficient. Since the 1970s, pressures for energy security, reliability, and efficiency, physical efficiency, have encouraged the development and deployment of different kinds of information technology. The digital utopians have argued that microprocessors and networks are the key to achieving more reliable, secure, and efficient systems, the key to sustainability. But this leads to then my two-part argument, which is, first of all, that digital utopianism actually played a really important role in encouraging industry restructuring in the 1980s and 1990s. Restructuring presupposed that microprocessors and networks would be transformative. However, in practice, the promises of digital utopians have fallen short. In practice, the use of information technology entails trade-offs between the many goals for the smart grid: efficiency, security, and reliability. And the utilities have consistently deployed information technology in an effort to cut costs, but in the process have traded security, reliability, and even a little bit of physical efficiency for their primary goal, which is economic efficiency. Thank you.